Hello, let's cut to the chase. My community and I simulated actual Minecraft civilizations for about 4 real-life years. Not some tacky-hacky YouTube video with 5 biome islands, pre-written events, and random groups. No. Organized cities, religions, politics, wars, and over 10,000 wiki pages of server history. I'm here to tell you the stories of the top 5 greatest empires from the Stoneworks Minecraft server, which you can join today to make your own empire in our new world at the IP play.stoneworks.gg. First, we define what an empire is. I'll be using this checklist that mirrors how real empires work to suss out what's a true empire. Because on our server's 2 worlds of Rathnir and Eldham, we have a lot of weird political entities that blur the lines between empire, coalition, hegemony, unions. It's difficult to categorize complex groups. So here, I'll be using this checklist that mirrors how we usually think about real empires. And then, I'll be ranking them by their power and their territory. Number 5. The Soleannen Imperium. All the way back in the world of Rathnir's beginning, there was founded what we call the Asarian civilization. This culture has spread across the world and grown several dominant empires for over 300 years. We start with a later one of these many Asarian empires called the Soleannen Imperium. In the calendar year of 131 of the Traveler's Era, 2 nations disputed over which of them was the legitimate successor of a once prosperous and glorious Asarian Empire. With the help of the leaders of the Soleannen Church, the 2 states settled their differences and united into a single empire that could reclaim the uncontested glories of an ancient past. The Soleannen Imperium, as it was called, held most of its power in the server aristocracy. Many of its leaders were part of the political circles that held lots of money and loot. They owned the biggest cities, had access to strong mercenary armies, and even secretly used evil black magic to summon resources out of thin air. And this corruption would ultimately lead to their downfall. The power of its representative council and emperor, held in the core territories of Historia, Yemu-Audal, and Bardonia, reached all the way across Rathnir, and even had a parallel branch in the other world of Eldham. As some revolutions began to flare up from its smaller side territories, the emperor and some of the Imperium's core leaders started going mad and paranoid, corrupted by the black magic they were using to fuel their empire's wealth and expansion. When one Asarian province angered the emperor, he occupied it with his troops, outraging the region's aristocracy under him. The head bishop of his church, who was also driven mad by the black magic, confronted the emperor over this, and both corrupted souls started a vicious brawl, where they mortally wounded each other and died there on the same floor. The death of the emperor removed a keystone from the Imperium's government. There was a succession crisis, and the core territory of Bardonia rebelled and seceded from the empire. The weakened Imperium briefly had another empress which consolidated its holdings, but it was clear there was no certain future for anyone in the Imperium. So some leaders of a nearby city, players named Papa Philly and Healy, took advantage of this instability. They teamed up with several aristocrats and a powerful mercenary group, and they reached out to all the provincial leaders in the heartlands of Yemu-Audal and Historia. Most of them just wanted the protection of a strong empire, and so they all diplomatically left the Imperium. They were absorbed under Philly and the mercenaries, becoming the great empire of Certaria. This is the brief history of the Soleannen Imperium.
Number 4. The Bardonian Empire. Bardonia is probably one of the most iconic civilizations in Minecraft history. Over time, Bardonia has risen and fallen more than a dozen times with varying success, leaders, and civil strife, but its imperial peak came between the years of 51 and 77. Leading up to all this, a band of demonic warriors invaded Rathnir called the Ferrymen, who set up shop across the world and started their own conquests. After themselves being defeated by the Ferrymen, Bardonia rallied the nations of Rathnir to march on their base in the town of Istanbuldur, where the Ferrymen slaughtered them in battle. Most of the original Bardonian leaders were killed here, so the state collapsed. There was an intense power struggle to claim the title of Chancellor, with coups, secessions, and assassinations. But in the end, player the Mobius came out on top. He and his internal minister, Ice, led the country pretty smoothly and got it back on its feet, avoided civil war, and rebuilt its decimated population. But soon after, an ancient Bardonian prophet of the Dandelions returned from hiding, and he took the reins of the reform government as its emperor. The prophet launched a campaign against their rival neighbor of Ryzan, capturing it after only a couple battles and annexing the whole territory. This new Bardonian Empire rallied around the prophet, gaining vassal provinces around the world and starting a second world coalition of states bound by their military might. But the prophet became corrupted by power and the evil possessed corpse of the old Bardonian chancellor. So the prophet turned from a wise leader of the Dandelion tradition into a religious zealot. He and the Bardonians started making enemies left and right, and the empire's stability slowly unraveled. Bardonia's military faction, called the Chancellor's Hands, turned on him. The prophet had personal enemies with the most powerful aristocracy of Rathnir in the nations like Viadoxa, Aurora, and Yemu-Outdal, and all the players of smaller countries feared that Bardonia would come, crush them, and add them to their empire. So the Archon leaders of Viadoxa, the legendary Hazel and Loic, secretly plotted with the leaders of the world. And at a set time, they sprung their revolution. Bardonia's territories all rebelled at once, and Viadoxa led the world coalition into the capital of New Darasterok. Many soldiers of the Chancellor's Hands retreated from the city, and instead, they punitively assaulted Viadoxa and the rebelling colonies. The coalition broke through the walls of the Bardonian capital. They took the Senate House, and they slew the prophet. Rathnir's Second World War, called the Allium War, was a Bardonian defeat. And in only a few battles, the empire crumpled in on itself and was destroyed. Three, the First Asarian Empire. The First Asarian Empire was the progenitor of all Asarian civilization and Soleannen culture. As it started from humble beginnings, and by the year 32 of the Traveler's Era, they'd conquered the world and ascended to the realm of the gods. Going all the way back to the first year of Rathnir's calendar, the sun god worshippers of the Asarian Empire became one of the preeminent forces of the world after winning a crusade against neighboring void god worshippers. Asaria grew as its divine emperor, Zika Ost, indoctrinated the people with a religious and cultural fanaticism that cemented Asarian nationalism into their hearts and souls. With sheer personality, unparalleled culture, and a decent military presence, the Asarian leaders expanded the empire out until it bumped up against their rivals in the neighboring empire of Yemu-Outdal. After several years of rivalry for the regions and islands between them, Yemu-Outdal became increasingly unstable, especially when their empress, Dalatra, stepped down and her imperial crown went missing. The Asarian Emperor and their allies then marched on the capital of Yemu-Outdal and claimed the throne for themselves. They spun propaganda that this was the proclamation of a new holy dynasty, that of the Neo-Soleannen Empire. The world became divided over this, and the tension sparked Rathnir's first ever world war, the Trillium War. After a series of battles, Asaria and her allies came out on top, and they exerted power over the world as they saw fit. Their ally of Bardonia chose to launch a massive conquest against its neighbors and former enemies, and suddenly, many smaller nations were thrown into the chaos of frantic diplomacy and defensive wars. Asaria did not press any conquests except for their original claims to the throne of Yemu-Outdal, and therefore, they presented themselves as the protectors against the mobilizing Bardonian forces. The smaller states around Asaria happily submitted themselves to the foot of the emperor as vassals, and so the Asarian Empire expanded across several continents and engaged in regional proxy wars all over. But soon, after all the homegrown resistance against them, Bardonia's momentum slowed down and stopped. They briefly held on to their first empire until their nation was consumed by internal strife and civil war. Asaria was now uncontested and dominant upon the world map. Its leaders, still fanatical religious zealots, then planned to exalt their sun god Solaris as the most powerful of all above the world. They gathered the Asarian nobility at a ritual henge, where they together sang a sacred chant, and sacrificed themselves to the sun god. The island of old void worshippers sank, the capital city was destroyed, and the entire Asarian Empire was sacrificed to their gods. Its outer provinces split into warring petty kingdoms, and its homeland was destroyed and desolate. In the days to come, the Asarian homeland became haunted by the spirits of those who had ascended, and wielding spectral swords and armor, they attacked all who ventured and settled on the Asarian lands without submitting to their gods and culture. The spirits kept the land unsettled for several years, until they organized into a proper army and launched conquests out across the world, taking new states for themselves and destroying those that were old and corrupt. This is the story of the first Asarian Empire. After this would reform a second, called the Imperium Nidea, and then later incarnations like the previously mentioned Soleannen Imperium, the Third Asarian Empire, the Empire of Neden, and many more. Asaria, therefore, is not just a state. It has transcended into becoming an idea that its successors aspire to, with glory that they still wish to reclaim. Number 2. The Iraqi Imperium. This empire dominated the entire Eastern Hemisphere in the world of Eldham. But way back when, the goblin tribe of Iraqi was exiled across the sea to a new region, where they set up some tiny city-states that would raid each other and their neighbors. That was until one human refugee showed up named Neo-Aurelian, who whipped them into shape and consolidated them around a new capital city called Iraq. The name of the game for Neo was slow and steady expansion, building power around himself and training trusted loyalists to do the daily functions of state. Neo played royale politique. He married a magical noblewoman from the faraway land of Druk-Yul. He accepted all sorts of refugees and retired marauders as citizens to build his population. He supported the rebels in a nearby civil war and submitted them as victorious vassals. He helped set up a regional political alliance when a neighboring nation got struck with a massive war, and he leveraged his position in that alliance to annex its largest state. Later, rumors circulated about a conspiracy to steal land by their northern neighbor, an old and previous hegemonic power. So Neo launched an opportunistic war against them, defeating them and later taking their territory. Iraqi went from a collection of savage city-states to one of Eldham's most feared powers. Now, it became a game of making friends with other nobles and mercenary armies and playing on their chessboard of politics. The Empire joined into the massive coalitions which dominated the geopolitical landscapes of Eldham, intervening with others on dozens of conflicts, sending troops around the world, and even invading into Rathnir, where the Eldhamite coalition beat one of its strongest kingdoms. The Iraqi Imperium kept expanding by inserting itself into conflicts, taking advantage of instability, making friendships with powerful people, and even threatening to launch a regional conquest that threw the entire world into a panicked chaos. But Neo-Aurelian began to grow old, and his influence over the empire started to fade. His wife, Lady Zaid, took power in his stead, but she had rivals who contested her, and they caused political instability in vying for the throne. As it spiraled into a full-blown succession crisis, one of Lady Zaid's peers, named Catalyst, plotted with the unhappy provinces of the empire. And when the time was ripe, they launched the Old Banners Rebellion, and rapidly dissolved the empire into a fractured mess of petty kingdoms. For its 65-year run, the Iraqi Imperium truly shook the earth, and it set the foundations for many of the most powerful leaders of the next generation of Eldham's politics. One of Neo's family members and trusted advisors, named Imperius Aurelian, used the massive fortune he had accrued from his business ventures to team up with a militant group called Shiro Kaneza. Together they established the spiritual successor empire of Velarin, which was so big and powerful it almost made this list of greatest empires on its own. Additionally, one of Neo's descendants, named Tillix, later founded the Second Iraqi Imperium in the north. From the start, though, they were enemies with a massive pre-existing block of Eldhamite states, and they survived for 11 years by trying to hold on to peace. But it quickly collapsed as war and instability tore it apart. A few honorable mentions. Now, a few nations certainly have had outstanding histories with immense power, but either they just missed the mark for this list, or they just missed the definition that I put on here. Let's first appreciate the triumvirate of Denumane, when 3 of Rathnir's most respected states joined together into a co-equal union that became the largest single entity up until that point. When I talk to people about this state, their response is always, yeah, what the f*** was that? It persisted for about a real-life month until the different geopolitical interests of its 3 constituent nations tore it apart. Next up, the Inhuman Horde, a political bloc of nations led by the Laurentish Kingdom, who essentially monopolized the politics and diplomacy of the world of Rathnir for several real-life months. If you were on the server at this time, you could not escape what the Horde was doing. Every single war, treaty, business deal, marriage had some part of the Horde involved in it, because everyone just decided to get together and to make life easier under this single political bloc.
Next is the Empire of Rathnir, where it was our friend Keikara's birthday. Happy birthday, Keikara, and all the biggest leaders gave their nations to her just for a day. Unironically, this would have been the actual largest single empire in Minecraft history. Number 1. The greatest empire in Minecraft history, the Crowned Lands of Asshai. This is a pretty recent one that was at its height only 3 years ago, in the year 311. The nations in the northwest region of Eldham developed a culture of friendly diplomacy. They didn't have to deal with many traumatizing invasions, colonizations, or power struggles. In this area of booming culture and cooperation, the nations slowly merged together over centuries, culminating in its greatest empire, the Crowned Lands of Asshai, with its beautiful capital in the floating city of Umakwa. They already had a massive population and several rich, beautiful towns, but far, far away politics would give it an immense military presence. For in the world of Rathnir, there was a gigantic empire called Uldarash which collapsed into a dozen warring states, and the fallen empire's military leaders sought refuge in Asshai, promising one day to return to their homeland. It was in this context that the Crowned Lands would be welded together into a global powerhouse, as the drums of war came to ravage their once peaceful region. You see, some neighboring states began to fight, the Holy Radican Empire and Aristios, as Aristios saw the resurgence of a charismatic leader who resented the influence that the Radican had, as they were the leaders of the booming rat ethnicity and religion. So Aristios rebelled. The two sides fought over the loyalty of local mayors, and the Aristios leader tried to deceive the international community that he had more popular support than he actually did. With war in hand, the Radican called on every mercenary, ally, and rat diaspora fighter that they could. Now, the Crowned Lands of Asshai, as the massive empire in the region, stepped forward and told the rats that they would help fight their war, but the Radican would have to join them as a co-equal member. They had been good friends for a while now, so they accepted, and the Northwest was unified against Aristios. The united Asshai and Radican twice attacked the coastal fortress of Purdon, but they were twice repelled. Then Aristios launched raids over the border into Asshai and the Radican. What followed was 14 years of vicious fighting in the borderlands, until the united Asshai and Radican successfully attacked and captured the capital city of Akira Shalam, getting most of Aristios to capitulate. They annexed these provinces and left a tiny Aristios as a rump state. Now, as a diverse union welded together by the forge of war, the Crowned Lands of Asshai looked to expand outward. But they didn't act like normal empires that would opportunistically gobble up anything they could. No, instead, Asshai only consensually absorbed other nations in their own backyard, so that its new subject would share a regional culture and Asshai could be a strong influence and protector, rather than some oppressive overlord. This is how they slowly grew over a century to dominate northern Eldham. But it wasn't only this corner of this world. Remember that old collapsing empire in Rathnir, whose military leaders fled to Asshai in Eldham? Well, those military leaders later returned to their homeland, a checkerboard of exhausted petty kingdoms. And right in the middle of this continent, they established a little foothold of Asshai territory. This continent of petty kingdoms was battered and traumatized by war, particularly from a group called Venovia, which led the nearby Laurentish Kingdom and the global political bloc of the Inhuman Horde, those guys we just talked about as an honorable mention. Asshai saw opportunity here, and they teamed up with many of the petty kingdoms of Haven against Venovia and their inhuman horde. Through several fights in many kingdoms, with triumphant wins and sacrificing losses, Asshai and the petty kingdoms of Haven pushed the horde out of their corners of the continent. Now, all these kingdoms saw Asshai as a competent protector and guarantor of their autonomy, so they pledged themselves to the Eldhamite Empire, and slowly but surely, Asshai rebuilt the borders of the gigantic, old, fallen empire. But now, it was under their control. Asshai was now poised as the single heavyweight which could enter the arena of world wars and come out the other side victorious. Now, the politics of Eldham are such that every so often, a giant coalition forms that absolutely dominates the entire world, until its internal politics inevitably collapse inwards, and they eat themselves alive. At this time, this was the Celestial Accords Treaty Organization, or CATO, and of course, Asshai was a powerful constituent nation. These allies together started a 35-year period of wars that would rock Eldham and destroy ancient empires. First, Asshai helped its powerful ally, called the AWE, to invade and conquer its rising neighbor of Atlechia. Then, a tiny democracy declared war on the Second Iraqi Imperium, and Cato aided the little democracy by directly invading the rising Imperium, causing it to shatter apart. Then, a rambunctious city-state controlled by the ally of Redariv revolted and invaded the rest of the country, which Asshai helped put down. You can see here that Cato clearly dominated the world of Eldham and held its politics in a bloody, iron grip. But then, the unstoppable alliance began to fracture from within as tensions rose in the world's south. The immensely powerful AWE started conflicting with some southern nations that were trying to unify and bolster their own power. And in this, the AWE supported a bloodthirsty mercenary group that was hell-bent on looting and pillaging one of Asshai's most beautiful cities. This mercenary support broke down relations to where Asshai left the Cato alliance and joined up with those unifying nations of the south. And of course, that meant war. Both sides launched raids and looted each other's helpless towns. The eastern territories of the AWE rose in rebellion. The AWE besieged the southern city of Winter Rose, but was held down there in a stalemate battle. Then the army of Asshai and her allies marched through the rebelling AWE provinces, and after 2 battles in the homeland, their capital city of Steinberg was captured and destroyed. The AWE's leadership bitterly fell out over this defeat, and the ancient southern empire here was broken and carved up. Now in the global arena, there was only the crowned lands of Asshai and its new friends. The story of Asshai is one that sparks heated debate and argument. For some, it shows the empire as a strong constitutional state, a liberator and protector of innocent players. But for others, it had a heavy hand in the destruction of their homes, subjugation, and humiliation. It's hard to tell an accurate story of an empire that brought out both the best and worst of leadership, politics, and violence. In January of 2023, Stoneworks announced that its 2 worlds of Rathnir and Eldham would soon be frozen as we transitioned to a new world. For Asshai, its regional leaders on the Rathnir continent of Haven gave an ultimatum, for they wanted to use their constitutional right to secede. And after it was granted, the land once again split into a mess of petty states. And after that, the government of Asshai split apart, and the whole empire followed suit. You have to join the server today, because we just started a fresh new world. Build your empire and make the history books at the IP play.stoneworks.gg. Thank you for watching.